that for us to take consistent action and beat procrastination is we need to get emotionally involved with the idea, with the decision that we want to take action on. I think that the common challenge is that we lack the psychological and behavioral resourcefulness to navigate an environment that is so polarizing, gating effect. So that's what I want to share with you. There's a simple, quick framework that I think could be useful, and I call it S.T.A.C. If you ever wondered why some of us have these great ideas, but they never seem to make the light of day. I'm sure you, like me, have had great ideas about how to improve yourself, your family, your community, your business, your team, maybe even the world at large, but there seems to be a disconnect between the point of decision and the point of consistent action and habits to make those ideas a reality. And in this video, I want to share a few ideas, frameworks, and insights that are science-based in terms of how we can better navigate that challenge. And procrastination isn't something that's individual or personal to you and you alone. I think we all face that challenge. And evolutionary science has actually proven that procrastination actually comes from a deep-seated need for survival and security. I think if you've studied any amount of behavioral economics, psychology, and marketing, you'll understand that human beings are a lot more risk averse than they are, enthusiastic about pursuing or chasing new opportunities and new ventures and new innovations. There seems to be a default mechanism in the human mind that seems to have served our survival, that we would rather keep things the way they are than to risk failure through changing them, right? So if we live in an environment that's filled with so much distraction, so much saturation, so much noise, that we are now at the point that maybe most people watching this are, that we sometimes feel polarized when we expose ourselves to this sort of content in media, we retreat to being a lot more conservative in our own behavior as a result, right? So if the environment around us is so threatening, if the environment around us is so uncertain, why would we then add further uncertainty and threats to our survival by taking actions towards a new venture that might be risky or uncertain or unproven? So this is the conundrum that we face as humans, and through this video I want to share just a few ways that I think we could sort of better navigate that dynamic and challenge. The common challenge I think we may face today isn't that we lack resources or opportunities per se. I think that the common challenge is that we lack the psychological and behavioral resourcefulness to navigate an environment that is so polarizing, so distracted, so noisy, that we'd rather opt to not take actions that will disrupt the status quo, that will disrupt what we already have going on, right? So if the environment around us is so uncertain, we would rather keep what we have in terms of our behavior, our structures, our habits, our results to a large extent. We'd rather keep that as and how it is right now than to risk it in the face of so much uncertainty. So if you think of how humanity has evolved, our ancestors had to literally navigate an environment that was filled with so much uncertainty. Now you ask yourself why evolution or advancement took so long. It's because advancement had to happen in the face of so much uncertainty in an environment that was really threatening to our survival. So if you think of somebody living in the savannah, a hunter-gatherer, he had to be constantly scanning his environment for anything that could either attack him or anything that could pose as food that he could then attack. So he had to be aware of predator and prey. He had to be aware of what he could avoid and seek. So if you think of how our more primitive ancestors may have lived, they lived in an environment that was filled with so much uncertainty that we have also learned this trait in the modern age. So if you think of how human beings live, we either seeking or avoiding things that can impact our survival. So in the face of that, the rate of progress is going to be a lot more harder to achieve than maintaining the status quo. So it's a evolutionary trait we've all inherited, and it's nothing personal to you. All we need to do is understand how the mind works and leverage those behavioral and psychological triggers to work for us instead of against us. So if you think of procrastination in that light, you'll understand that it's not something personal to you as an individual, but it's a pro-survival mechanism that we just need to learn the strategies, tools, and triggers to actually make us take action even in the face of uncertainty. So when it comes to procrastination, I have a personal story, right? So growing up mostly as a chubby kid, I think, in your earlier years, it's fine and you can get away with being a chubby kid. But when you get into adulthood and you start, going to varsity and getting around a new circle of friends, that identity, that, state of being might not be conducive, right? Especially with the ladies. But I found out that actually being this chubby guy now wasn't something that's going to work. So that really triggered my need and desire to change. Over that time period, I started and stopped a lot of weight loss programs, right? So I had been doing some weight training at the time, taking diet pills, doing anything I can and could to reduce my weight, right? So, and I remember at one point during the holidays, right, because this is something I'd started the journey of in my varsity years. And during the holidays, as one does, you go back home. And then when I went back home, I had seen some of my old friends and, we were catching up and everything. And I was telling them where I am and they're like, hey man, you're looking a bit different. What are you doing? And I told them that I'm just trying to lose weight. And I remember the response that this guy had towards me, one of my friends at the time. The response he had towards me was so ridiculing and just put me off and made me so angry in such a way that to prove him wrong, I went all out. Now, I went all out and I became so much more convicted in my mission to lose the weight or to get fit that I think I may have overcorrected, right? But the point is, up until that point, I hadn't really taken my weight loss and fitness journey seriously. Yes, I knew it's something I had to do, something I intended to do, but I never really got into it and got emotionally connected to it in the way that I had after he'd put me down. So when the guy put me down, I got so determined. And I think that's what makes the difference between people that make a decision and then take consistent action on it, is that it has to have an emotional connection. One of the best gifts that person gave me is that they've actually gave me the emotional trigger to be as determined and as consistent as I've been up until now. So you can use emotional and environmental triggers deliberately to get you to take action. So you need to understand and categorize what are those triggers. There's nothing that works better to get someone into taking action than emotion. So if you think of how the human brain is structured, right? So the newer part of the human anatomy in terms of our evolutionary journey is the frontal cortex. So that's the part of the brain that's responsible for decision making. Then you've got the hippocampus, which is responsible for emotional associations, learning, as well as bridging information from decision into emotional association. And then you've got the basal ganglia, which is responsible for the actions you take and the habits you form, right? So the one key component, like I mentioned earlier, what's the missing connection between the decisions we make and the actions we take, right? The missing connection I found, and science actually substantiates this, is that we need to leverage the emotional associations we have to the decisions we make. So what that means is that you need to make an emotional connection, like I did in my story when I was ridiculed in my efforts to lose weight. What you need to do is that you need to create such a strong emotional, intensive commitment and desire for change that you'll be automatically sprung into action. So how it works is that your prefrontal cortex makes a decision to say, okay, I have an idea and I want to act on this idea. That's the responsibility of your prefrontal cortex. Your hippocampus says, okay, you've made this decision, you want to act on this idea, but why do you want to take action on this idea? And then that's the emotive and learning part that we need to form part of this 3-step journey. So you need to make sure that we can associate the right emotions, the right feelings, and the right learnings to the actions we want to take, so that the hippocampus then relays that to the basal ganglia, which is responsible for the motor actions needed to take action and form habits over time. Now, I know lots of scientific jargon, lots of scientific talk, but essentially what it means is that for us to take consistent action and beat procrastination is we need to get emotionally involved with the idea, with the decision that we want to take action on. Without emotion, there will be no change. So if you realize that emotions are the thing that actually helped us navigate the environment, in the earlier stages of human evolution, the emotions are what helped us actually navigate the environment, because your logical framework was too slow, and that if you had seen something that could be threatening in the environment, your emotions would trigger you to take action, as opposed to having to logically figure out and confirm that it's a threat or not. Right, so the emotional response at the time would have been anxiety. The emotional response would have been heightened awareness, where adrenaline would kick in, testosterone would kick in, and you would either flee or you would fight. Right, so what triggers that need for action is an emotional association that triggers that cascading effect. So I have a quick framework that I think could be valuable to you, especially if you find yourself in a situation where you don't know why or how to make that emotional connection. So it's a quick and simple framework I call S.T.A.C, and it's actually an acronym for stories, triggers, asking the right questions, consistency of reinforcement, as well as keeping track and measuring your progress. So the first principle is stories. So what are the stories that we tell ourselves, and how do those stories affect our emotional resourcefulness to take action? Now, when I say stories need to be controlled, it can be both external stories and internal stories. So number one, the internal stories we tell ourselves about how and why we need to trigger our emotions to be as resourceful as possible so we can take actions here. And when I say trigger your emotions, I mean a productive and resourceful use of emotion, and not a destructive and negative use of emotion where you harm yourself or others. So you can use anger, frustration, annoyance to actually spur you into action. So you can use that emotional trigger to say, okay, what are the stories that I need to be telling myself in order to take action? What is this feeling of annoyance telling me about this situation, and how can I act in a way that is resourceful, congruent, productive, and conducive? Take control of your personal stories that you tell yourself. And number two, you need to take control of the interpersonal stories that are being told in the environment. Now, with social media, with the news, so much news is out there, so much bad news is actually in the environment telling us that we're under threat, and we need to control that narrative, because like I said earlier, if the narrative outside is that everything is so bad and that you are under threat, you will take less risks given those circumstances. So you need to take deliberate control of what you let into your mind. All the stories that the external world tries to impose into your mind, you need to take control of that. So you need to be the person advertising and marketing to yourself in a lot more deliberate and resourceful way. The second part of the acronym being triggers. So you need to be well aware of what triggers you to get into the most resourceful and emotionally resourceful state, right, for action. You need to be aware of what are the things that maybe in your personal history, what are the things that in your preferences and values would trigger you to form an emotional connection that gets you to take action on a decision, right? So you need to understand that you need to start taking control of your environment and setting up your environment in such a way that there are triggers that help you take action. For example, I personally now keep a pair of sneakers and a gym bag in my car all the time, because why? Every chance I get, I want to be able to be ready to go to the gym. So I don't want to have to create friction between me and going to the gym. What is it that triggers you to get into the most resourceful and emotional state so you can take actions on your decisions and on your ideas? So that is the process of triggering. And we know that triggers can be both negative and positive. So you need to make sure that to the extent that you can, you control your environment and surroundings so that you can take full advantage of your own stories and set up the triggers in your environment that can get you to take action. So the A is about asking the right questions, right? So these questions are like prompts. They can create an urgency for action and a lot more resourceful state of being. So number one, what's the thing I stand to lose if I don't take action? Number two, in terms of the second question you can ask is, what's the smallest action step I can take now towards making that a reality, towards making my dreams a reality, towards making that idea a reality? What's the smallest action steps we can take? Because sometimes we tend to think that, to create massive impact, we need to take massive actions, but in most cases, we need to start off with smaller actions. So at the earliest stages, you need to ask yourself, what's the smallest action step I can take on a consistent basis for me to get to the outcome I want to get to eventually, right? So we understand that progress happens on a spectrum, that it's not all going to happen immediately, but if you start getting into the habit of taking consistent action towards making your goals a reality, that will become your outcome. In most cases, great things happen in really small increments over a long period of time. So to create your vision, to create your idea into a reality, you need to be able to consistently take actions over time that can get you there. So a question I often ask myself is, what's the smallest action step I can take right now towards making that a reality? Another question I sometimes ask is, what are the good things that I can expect as a result of taking action, or what are the negatives I can expect as a result of not taking action? And I think that's a more pertinent and potent question, because like we said earlier, human beings are highly risk averse. So if you ask the question enough times, some answers will start showing up. And the trick here is to stack those answers to the point where taking action seems to be an inevitable outcome, and it's something you can't wait to do, because while you have stacked up so many answers related to that question that you can no longer procrastinate. The consistency of reinforcement is also quite important. So how often do you apply the earlier frameworks I've given you? How often you apply telling yourself these stories that get you in the most emotive and resourceful state as possible? You have to be consistent in doing that. You have to be consistent in managing your environmental triggers. You have to be consistent in asking yourself those two resourceful questions that I just gave. So the consistency and how you apply that, even at a small scale, could have massive impacts in the long term. Like I said, most progress doesn't happen overnight. Most progress doesn't happen with these huge quantum leaps and jumps in progress, but it happens through small repetitions of actions and behaviors done over a long time that create massive impacts in the long term. So you need to consistently set up a habit, a ritual, a routine that helps you get into a more psychologically and physically resourceful state for you to take action. So you need to make sure that you're constantly asking yourself the right questions, you're constantly setting up your environment with the right triggers, and you're constantly telling yourself the right stories to get you into a more emotively resourceful state for you to take consistent action. Last but not least, keeping track of your success and wins. Now, whenever we start taking action and we're making progress, one of the biggest hindrances could be that we aren't taking a step back and celebrating our milestones and celebrating our wins whenever we do get them. So one of the things that often happens when people don't take consistent action over a long term is that they don't have a reward process. They don't have a reward and a measurement process for that reward. Because if you do not measure, you don't know when you've made progress, and you might not think you've made progress because you're not looking for it. So you need to make sure that you've got a habit, a system, a framework for you to constantly measure against and actually celebrate whenever you do make significant progress. So if you found any value in this video, please leave a like, share, or subscribe. And I'd love to hear from you too. So if you have any stories related to your own personal journey of beating procrastination, what was the framework you used, and was emotion a part of that framework? And how have you applied it consistently over time to achieve some of your most significant goals?